If you found this video, you want to stay ahead of everybody else now so you're not falling behind in the next fantasy football season of 2024. And lucky for you, I'll be going over all the top lessons learned from this season that just finished in fantasy football that we can use to help us win leagues next year a billion times easier. If you're feeling generous, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're not already. It lets me know you guys like the content, and I'll be making more throughout the offseason as well. You guys don't want to miss those. But I do not want to waste anybody's time. The number one lesson we learned this year is to hustle on the waiver wire. And this might seem pretty obvious, but it's very important to do your research or follow somebody else that does. Because waiver wires have continued to win leagues, especially this season. And if we look at the trends of the past 10 years in fantasy football, we have seen more top 25 finishes coming from the waiver wire this year than ever before, and the number has been rising every single year. I mean, look at guys like Kyron Williams, Puka Nacua, Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, even Zamir White at the end of the season, Jerome Ford. There's a whole bunch of guys every single year that can help us win fantasy championships, or at least a couple extra games here and there off the fantasy football waiver wire. And the real reason the fantasy waiver wire is so important, not just for a couple extra wins picking up some players, but it's because you can use it as a trade portal to infinite players of better value. Going through and adding guys like Taysom Hill halfway through the season, Ty Chandler, or even Keaton Mitchell have proven really valuable because we could flip them and trade them for even more value and keep continuing that ladder of making our team even better. So not only can you find top 20 players on the waiver wire, you can also use some other guys as trade bait to get some other top proven guys. And the next thing you might ask is, well, how do you know who's good off the waiver wire and who's not? And the answer to that is by looking more into the usage and the real statistics. That's not just fantasy points. If you've been around this page for long enough, you've heard me talk about it. There's been a lot of instances where you see a guy put up 20 fantasy points one week, but you look more into the stats, he doesn't really have the time on field, the usage, the snaps, the targets, all the things we look for to be a consistent, viable guy. And everyone will go through and pick him up because they see the 20-point fantasy week and think he's some amazing talent, but that's usually not the case. The thing you want to be doing is going through, looking at the players. Maybe they don't have 20-point fantasy weeks. Maybe they had 7, 5, 6, 8, 9, but they're playing a good amount of snaps, they're seeing the field a lot, and they're getting a decent amount of targets. They're just not finishing with a lot of fantasy points. Those are the guys that you want. You can even look at trends with injuries and game scripts and see, okay, well, maybe he's going to start getting more snaps, more usage, all this stuff. It also applies to running backs, tight ends, but that's how you find the edge on the waiver wire over everybody else that's just looking at the fantasy points. The second lesson that we learned from this season is that we need to be paying up for our top elite running backs and wide receivers in 2024, more specifically wide receivers though. We're entering a new era of fantasy football where we're going out with the old and in with the new, especially as of late. We got guys like Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Hopkins. All of these guys that were really good a couple years ago are starting to stop and come on the decline. And you can no longer just load up on a million running backs in the beginning of the draft and be perfectly fine throughout the remainder of the season. The fantasy football scheme is changing, and so is the NFL. We're transitioning into more of a wide receiver centric league, at least in the first couple rounds. Getting these elite guys are something that's going to really help us and has helped us this season. Sticking with the running backs and in the old times has really started to hurt us. And let me give you some numbers so you know I'm not just speaking out of nothing. CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 1 this season. He finished 110 points further than the wide receiver 9. And the same goes for running backs. Christian McCaffrey scored 122 more fantasy points than the RB2, Travis Etienne, and the same thing goes from the RB2 to the RB7, 8, 9, and 10. There's a really big discrepancy from the top guys to the mid-level guys that is only drafted with a couple pick difference in our fantasy drafts in the beginning of the season. So don't be afraid to reach for these top wide receivers to create a secure team. A lot of the times what you want to do is create a high floor, high upside team in the beginning and not take too much risk. So later in the 5th or 6th round, you can pick up on the guys that have a little bit more risk but more upside because you already have that safe base. Because in those 5th, 6th, 7th rounds, that's usually when you find the true league winners, because how much leagues can you really win if you're already drafted in the 1st or 2nd round? But the reality of it is that we're transitioning more into a wide receiver heavy fantasy football league. Wide receivers are more reliable. Running backs get injured a lot more often. There's a lot of committees. A whole bunch of things can go wrong with running backs, and there's not that many. But lesson number 3 is that we need to create our teams and build our teams for the fantasy playoffs, whether that's from the draft itself or from trading. Building your team and maximizing its roster potential for the fantasy football playoffs is ultimately what you want to be doing. Drafting from the beginning of the season or trading for guys halfway through like Lamar Jackson, Brandon Ayuk, Puka Nacua with really good playoff schedules has won leagues for people, specifically single-handedly by themselves. Now that doesn't mean take Puka Nacua over Tyreek Hill in the draft or trade him away for nothing, but it does mean that if you're between two guys in the draft or in a trade and they have similar value, go with the guy with a better playoff schedule because it's going to give you better results later down the line of the season. And after all, we are all playing for fantasy playoffs, and it's not impossible to get into the fantasy playoffs when half of the league makes it. And there's a lot of ways to go about this lesson and this strategy, because you can also draft a bunch of guys with really easy beginning of the year schedules in the first couple months, and then when they build up their fantasy case and their fantasy value, you can trade them away before their schedule gets really hard. So you can just flip from the hard to the easy schedules and be good for the rest of the season. But that's a little bit harder to do because a lot of people's leagues don't really like to trade. Just make sure you're optimizing your roster for playoffs every chance you can get, and think in that mindset of playing for the fantasy playoffs. But the fourth lesson, and probably the most important one that everybody just ignores and doesn't want to think about and just really gets blindsided by, is that we cannot have short tempers with our rookies. We have to understand that football players are people too, and it's kind of ignorant to just assume that they're going to come in, get a million touches, a million targets, all of this usage straight from the jump. I mean, going from college to NFL is a really big jump, and it's going to take a couple weeks, even months, to get acclimated to the speed and pace of the NFL play. It's a big difference. We cannot overreact to slow starts of rookies. And there is countless amounts of examples for this. Jaden Reed only had one game over 13 fantasy points in the first 9 games of the season, but then from week 10 on to the rest of the fantasy football season through week 17, he was the wide receiver 10. Same thing goes for Rashee Rice. He only had one game over 14 fantasy points all the way up till week 11, and then after that, for the rest of the season through week 17, he was the wide receiver 7 in fantasy points. So do not give up on your rookies, no matter how high you drafted them. Even Jahmyr Gibbs, he had 0 games over 15 fantasy points in his first 4 weeks, and then after that, he blossomed into an RB8 finish for the rest of the season, and was the RB3 from weeks 5 through 17. Do not give up on your rookies, even if they start slow. I know it's hard to do, because when you see all these guys going off on the waiver wire looking good, it's kind of just like fool's gold. You lose sight of why you drafted the rookies in the first place, and you put them back on waivers, and so many people won leagues by having these rookies on their team. For next year, we should be loading up on rookies in the 11th, 10th round, anything later than that, even in free agency, and stashing them on our roster so that later down the line of the season, when they do break out, we're going to have these guys and not lose sight of them. Now, obviously, there's going to be some busts, guys like Jonathan Mingo, who didn't really have that great of a season, Quentin Johnston didn't, but more often than not, the top rookies that we do draft end up being pretty decent and startable fantasy guys later down the line of the season. Just don't lose sight of it. It's something really easy to do. But the 5th lesson, and one that's a little bit more complicated, is you don't need to reach on quarterbacks. And let me explain this one a little bit more, because there is a lot of discrepancy and controversial takes about this. I should name this lesson more of, if you don't get a top 2 or 3 guy, just wait in the fantasy draft till you get a later pick for a later guy. We saw early regular guys like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts finish as top 3 guys and return their fantasy value perfectly. But if you don't end up getting one of those guys, most definitely just wait, because the drop off from QB5 to QB15 is really not that big of a difference. It's only a couple fantasy points. The best way I would combat this and get the best of both worlds is to draft high upside rushing quarterbacks like Anthony Richardson, like Justin Fields. They might not have finished that great this season. They both missed games with injury, and they're not on the best offenses. But if we look at the top 3 quarterbacks for this fantasy football season, we see number 1, Josh Allen had 457 rush yards with 15 rushing touchdowns. Number 2, Jalen Hurts. He had 601 rushing yards with 15 touchdowns as well. And number 3, Lamar Jackson. He had over 800 yards on the ground and 5 rushing touchdowns. It's a lot more difficult for pure pocket passers to finish in that elite top 1 or 2 quarterbacks, just because they don't have that rushing upside that gives you a high floor. So if you're not going to go with one of the elite rushing quarterbacks like a Josh Allen, like a Jalen Hurts, like a Lamar Jackson, go ahead and wait a couple rounds and get a guy that has some rushing upside and has some fantasy value himself, but goes a little bit later in drafts. Again, because the drop off from QB5, 6, 7 really isn't that drastic from the QB 15, 16, 17. And a prime example of this is Dak Prescott. He was being drafted in the 6th round of fantasy football drafts outside of the top 10 fantasy quarterbacks and finished as the QB4, right outside of all these other rushing quarterbacks. The same goes for Jordan Love. He finished the season as the QB5, but was undrafted in most leagues. Again, you really don't need to reach on these top quarterbacks unless they fall to you in the draft. I have no hate on drafting one of these top guys, but don't be afraid to wait, because Tua was also a really good player as well, being almost undrafted 7th, 8th, and 9th rounds of fantasy leagues. And again, you could also say the same thing for Brock Purdy, finished as the QB6, but was undrafted in leagues. There's so many examples of this. You don't need to reach on a quarterback. So the best strategy in the draft to take all these things together is to wait on quarterbacks to the later rounds, stack up on elite wide receivers and running backs like Tyreek Hill, like CMC, like Justin Jefferson, like Jahmyr Gibbs even, and get a high upside quarterback in the later rounds that has some rushing upside. That way you can max out the upside of your roster and get some really high upside and safe wide receivers earlier, and not depend on your quarterback solely to win you a league. And the drop off from wide receiver and running back from round 1 to 4 is a whole lot different than it is for quarterbacks. But lesson number 6, and probably the hardest for everybody to understand as well as myself and get down, is to not be afraid of adapting. Fantasy football itself is changing day to day, week to week, and you really need to be up to date on all the news, injuries, and everything else in between. More importantly, the narratives and trends. When it comes down to the end of the fantasy season, a lot of people get stuck on draft capital and name value, and it really comes back to bite them in the end. And Stephon Diggs is a prime example of this. Since week 9, he's only had one fantasy football week over double-digit fantasy points. The same thing can go for guys like Derrick Henry, Travis Kelce, Austin Eckler, guys that really aren't doing that good right now, but have really high name value and draft capital. It also feeds into part of the lesson that we are out with the old and in with the new. There's a whole new generation of guys coming into the league being top guys in fantasy and real NFL football. So when it comes to players that you drafted really high but are in a slump for a couple weeks, maybe even months, you gotta exercise your options of who to start, sit, and trade. For the most part, you have to completely get rid of the name value and just focus on the fantasy point production. It's similar to the other lesson about how we can't forget about our rookies early in the season when they're not producing. When it comes down to the late season and our top drafted guys just are not producing, we gotta make those decisions. The game is always trending, and it's really hard to sit a guy like Stephon Diggs for another guy like Rashee Rice because he's just not as proven and he hasn't been in the league dominating for very long. Now, this doesn't mean sit Christian McCaffrey for a guy like Gus Edwards, but it means that you need to be careful of your decisions and understand that you're gonna take take the L on the start sits every once in a while. It happens to everybody, but making a good judgment and being aware and safe with your decisions is something that you can't really get mad at yourself for. But another lesson that we did learn from the 2023 season moving into next season for next year in 2024 is that we can't get our brains wrapped around top tight ends and big name tight ends. And I know everybody has a different opinion on this, so it might be a little bit controversial. Let me dig a bit deeper into it. If we look at Travis Kelce, he did finish as the tight end 2 this season. He has been the biggest positional advantage in fantasy football since 2016. He's been the tight end 1 every single year outside of 2 years, this year and 2 years ago. Now, I'm not here to tell you he's washed, even though he did finish as the tight end 2, and he would have been the tight end 4 if TJ Hawkinson and Mark Andrews didn't get injured. But that's besides the point. The point is that drafting tight ends really early is not paying off this season, and this is really the first season that we started to see that. Travis Kelce was drafted as the tight end 1, a top 5 pick in most leagues, and he finished as the wide receiver 19 in total fantasy points. He's usually a top 5 wide receiver comparatively every single year. That's a big drop off. And the tight end 2 that was drafted this season was Mark Andrews. He finished as the wide receiver 48. Now, he did get injured for a lot of games, so if we put the numbers in and expected fantasy points, he would have been the wide receiver 28. Still not very good. And the tight end 3 we drafted this season was George Kittle. Played a full season, finished as the wide receiver 27 in points per game. It's just clear that drafting these super high tight ends at a super high draft capital aren't paying off anymore, where you can get a guy like Tyreek Hill at the same ADP, but will finish with 10 times more fantasy points. The top tight ends just really are not comparable to wide receivers this year, and I know we dealt with a lot of injuries, but still, it's really not that high of a payoff. Because let's take a look at the top tight ends that were drafted 1 through 10 this year. Because if we look at the top 10 tight ends that finished this season and the top 10 tight ends we drafted in order, it is a drastic difference. Sam Laporta, number 1, picked up off of waivers. Travis Kelce, number 2. Hawkinson, number 3. Ingram, number 4. Kittle, number 5. Njoku, number 6. Komet, number 7. McBride, number 8. Ferguson, number 9. And Schultz, number 10. That is drastically different from what we drafted in the beginning of the season. Half of those guys were picked up off the waivers in most leagues. And again, back to the new era of fantasy football, we have Travis Kelce going into his age 35 season, the number 1 tight end, and the number 2 tight end, Mark Andrews, is going into his age 29 season. It might be time to slow down on our tight ends and get some new up-and-coming guys that are drafted maybe even 2 rounds later, not even that far down. But that's all I got for you guys today. Let me know what lessons you guys are taking from this fantasy football season, and if you agree with any of the ones that I covered in this video today. I seriously appreciate you guys watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next fantasy football video recap, whatever it ends up being, in next week's video.